Pinned beneath the scorching desert sun, a sick Mustang lay trembling, abandoned to starve by a drunken man who cared nothing for its life. The stench of neglect hung thick in the dry air as the horse's labored breath caught the attention of a passing wanderer who, despite his own desperate circumstances, could not ignore the suffering creature. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. He crouched beside the horse, muttering under his breath about the cruelty of leaving such a proud animal to die in the unforgiving heat. His name was Jack Carson, a man hardened by years of scraping out a living in harsh environments, but never so hardened that he'd turn a blind eye to pain. The Mustang's ribs stood out like raw lines etched in its dusty hide, its eyes dulled by fever and thirst. Flies buzzed around an oozing wound on its flank, and every time the horse twitched its tail to chase them away, the effort seemed to sap the last of its strength. Jack pressed a hand against the horse's side, feeling the trembling from within, each small shiver echoing the fear and exhaustion that threatened to consume both of them. The day had been boiling hot for hours, and he could taste the salt of his own sweat on his lips as he tried to assess if the animal could even stand. In the distance, heat shimmered off the rocky desert plains, creating mirage-like images that danced on the horizon. Jack licked his chapped lips, dryness clawing at the back of his throat, and realized that if he stood here any longer, he risked draining his own limited resources. But the horse, big as it was, still had spirit flickering in its brown eyes. Whenever it managed to open them fully, leaving it behind felt like a betrayal of everything Jack believed in. His canteen was half empty, a mere swish of water in the bottom. He cursed under his breath, tore a strip of fabric from the once white bandana around his neck, and held it gently to the horse's muzzle to see if it could latch on and lick some moisture. The horse tried, but a violent cough racked its body, nearly knocking Jack back. Scanning the rocky desert terrain, Jack saw that about a half-mile to the north lay a patch of scraggly vegetation, a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was a trickle of water somewhere below the surface. It was a risk, but everything here was a risk. They didn't have the luxury of guaranteed safety. Time was already working against them. The sun would continue to blaze until it sank into the horizon, and then the temperature would plummet to near freezing after dusk. Injured, sick, and starved, the Mustang wouldn't make it through the night without some help. Jack wondered how a man could let this happen, how a drunken owner could so callously leave an animal behind. A wave of anger sparked in his chest, but fury wouldn't keep them alive. Steeling himself, Jack grabbed the horse's bridle, still hanging from its head, though worn and half-broken, and tried to coax the animal up. The Mustang let out a desperate, plaintive sound, half nicker, half whinny, and kicked weakly with its hind legs. The effort was pitiful, lacking the usual fire of a wild horse. Jack muttered words of encouragement, like a father urging a child through a difficult task. There was no response but another trembling attempt. The horse's knees buckled, and it collapsed back down, raising a small cloud of dust that clung to Jack's sweaty skin. It would have been easier to walk away. Every rational part of him screamed that he didn't owe this horse anything, that by trying to save it he risked losing the water, the supplies, the precious time he had left to get out of the desert alive. But Jack had seen enough cruelty in this world. If he walked away, he'd carry the guilt with him for the rest of his life. He'd fought too many battles, faced the harshness of nature too many times to let a creature that shared in this struggle die alone without at least trying. With careful effort, he poured a small amount of water from his canteen onto the cloth, then dribbled droplets onto the horse's muzzle. The animal's lips twitched, thirst guiding it to lap at the moisture. Jack saw the horse's eyelids flicker, as if it felt a surge of hope or at least relief. Even this small act drained Jack's meager supply. He looked at the canteen again, dismayed by how little water remained. The next question was how to move this sick, half-dead Mustang. He wasn't a large man, lean from constant travel, taut muscles born of necessity rather than luxury, and the horse easily outweighed him many times over. Still, he braced himself, dug his boots into the dirt, and tried again to haul the horse upright. This time the Mustang managed to sway on its legs, though it trembled badly. Its knees threatened to buckle at any moment, and Jack slid his arm under its neck, pressing his shoulder against the horse's powerful, but now emaciated chest to keep it from toppling. The horse's body heat radiated against him, and the smell of sickness clung to its hide. Jack fought the urge to gag. He needed to stay composed. He coaxed the Mustang with gentle words, small tugs on the bridle, and slow steps forward. The horse limped, favoring one leg. Jack noticed an old laceration crusted with blood just above the hoof, another gift from the drunken man, perhaps from a poorly fitted shoe or a savage strike with a blunt object. The desert floor was uneven, littered with sharp rocks and cacti that threatened to jab at the horse's tender hooves. Each laborious step felt like an eternity. Jack's own heart pounded with the effort, sweat pouring down his face as if he were in the midst of some fever dream. The sun showed no mercy. The heat pressed down on them like a smothering blanket, and Jack's vision swam with the brightness. A pair of vultures circled overhead, black silhouettes against the brilliant blue sky. Their presence felt like a haunting omen, a reminder that the desert had plenty of ways to claim those who weren't strong enough. Jack gritted his teeth, refusing to let that fate befall the creature beside him. Step by step, inch by inch, they moved forward, the horse lurching awkwardly on its swollen leg. Jack stumbling as the desert sand shifted under his worn boots. His canteen rattled against his belt, that faint slosh of water inside it, both a blessing and a curse. It wouldn't last them long, not out here. By the time they reached that scraggly patch of desert brush, Jack's mouth felt like sandpaper. He peeled off the soaking bandana from around his neck, wrung it out and touched it to the horse's muzzle again. The animal's ears flicked in faint relief, but it could barely muster the energy to bend its neck down to the vegetation. Jack saw that the ground was too dry here, the plants too shriveled to offer any real nourishment. There might be water deeper underground, but not in any place where they could easily dig. He needed to find a better spot, maybe a canyon or a rock formation that collected runoff. Out here on the open plain, the sun was the sole ruler, and anything that stood against it too long withered and died. Exhaustion gnawed at Jack. He was pushing himself to his limits, and the day wasn't nearly done. He had to keep going to find even the smallest sliver of shade, something that could buy them a few hours' rest without cooking them alive. The horse stumbled again, nearly dragging Jack down. A frustrated cry tore from his throat, and he dropped to one knee, breathing dust. He coughed violently, blinking grit from his eyes, then forced himself back to his feet. Standing was an act of defiance against the desert. The horse snorted, stepping unevenly, and a trickle of blood seeped from its flank wound. Jack pressed the cloth against it, trying to staunch the slow bleed. The infection was obvious. The wound smelled sour, and a thin ooze of pus indicated that the horse's condition was worse than he'd first guessed. Without proper care and clean water, the infection would kill the Mustang even if thirst and starvation didn't finish the job first. Yet something in the horse's gaze reminded Jack of a determination he'd felt in his own darkest hours. Those times when he was lost in a blizzard or pinned under debris in a remote canyon, memories he'd rather bury. He'd found that last spark of life, that last push to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The Mustang had that spark too. Jack sighed, leaning his forehead against the horse's neck for a moment. The heat radiated between them. He could practically feel the horse's rapid heartbeat. They were both prey to the desert now, two souls, clinging to existence. Jack swallowed the dryness in his throat and scanned the horizon again. A blur of rocky outcroppings to the west caught his attention. If there was going to be shade anywhere, it might be among those stone formations. He pointed them out to the horse as if the creature could understand him, and whispered, "Come on, it's just a bit farther." He wasn't sure if he was comforting the horse or himself. They had no choice but to move. The walk was brutal. Each minute felt stretched into agonizing lengths by the relentless sunlight. The earth itself shimmered, radiating heat in waves that distorted the view of everything beyond a dozen feet. Jack's legs ached, his shoulders burned from supporting the horse's weight when it staggered, and his vision grew spotty when he forgot to blink away the sweat. But he refused to give in. Step by step they trudged onward. The horse's breathing turned ragged, and more than once Jack was sure it would collapse and never get back up. Finally, after what felt like hours, but might have been far less, they reached the first craggy rocks. Jack guided the horse into the meager shadow cast by a towering boulder. Instantly, The scorching heat lessened, if only by a fraction. Jack's chest heaved as he slumped against the rock, letting the Mustang lean into him for support. For a moment, he allowed himself to rest, each breath sounding like a rasp against his dry throat. He peered at the sky, seeing those vultures again. They still circled. He wondered if they tracked him or the horse, or if they were simply patrolling the desert for the next meal. The idea sent a chill down his spine despite the heat. The horse coughed wetly, a sound that stabbed at Jack's conscience. He had to move again soon. This little slice of shade wouldn't last forever, and they needed water. Memories of desert. Survival tips he'd once learned in a battered old manual surged through his mind. Nights can be freezing. Days can be lethal. Always ration water, but never wait too long to hydrate. Jack realized he was at a tipping point. He could go for water in the off chance he found some deeper in the rocky area, but that risked leaving the horse alone, vulnerable. The other choice was to keep pressing forward together, hoping that the next formation had a hidden spring or a pocket of moisture. Neither choice felt safe. He took a small sip from the canteen himself, savoring the water's cool relief for a moment, before spitting some into his palm for the horse to lick. Hup! The Mustang's tongue flicked across his hand with surprising urgency, as if it recognized the gift. Jack felt a pang in his chest, remembering the horse he'd lost years ago in a flash flood. That memory never really left him. The sense of failure haunted him still. He let the horse rest a few minutes longer in the shade, watching the sweat trickle down its nose. Then, bracing himself, he stood and guided it deeper into the maze of rocks. The path wasn't easy. Steep inclines, loose gravel that threatened to send them slipping, jagged edges that snagged at their clothes and hide. The silence was eerie, broken only by the clack of hooves on stone, Jack's ragged breathing, and the buzzing of insects that lingered around the horse's wound. Jack batted them away, each movement costing him energy he didn't have to spare. As they climbed higher, he scanned for any sign of water, dark streaks in the rocks, damp patches of sand, or the distinctive glint of a pool hidden among boulders. His hopes rose and fell with each crest they crossed. Each time the desert seemed determined to deny them. The dryness of his mouth intensified, and he noticed the horse's nostrils flaring wider, a sign of pain and exertion. The infection in its wound was clearly worsening. Jack could feel the fever radiating from the animal's body. He thought about searching for medicinal herbs or a place to brew them, but that seemed laughable out here. He could hardly find a drop of water, let alone the resources for improvised veterinary care. Eventually they reached a spot where the stones parted just enough to form a small natural overhang, a low-ceilinged area of shade that might protect them from the worst of the sun's rays. Jack ducked inside, coaxing the Mustang to follow. He nearly cried out in relief when he felt the temperature drop a few degrees. It wasn't a real refuge, but it was better than being out on the open plain. He let the horse collapse onto the dusty ground. Its flanks heaved with each shallow breath, and a foam had begun to gather around its muzzle from the combination of thirst, fever, and strain. Jack knew they couldn't stay there indefinitely. Nightfall would bring a new set of challenges. Plummeting temperatures, potential predators like coyotes or mountain lions, but he needed a moment to gather himself, to think about the next move. The unyielding nature of the desert didn't leave much room for error. The line between life and death was razor thin. He eased himself down, back against the rough stone wall, and closed his eyes for just a moment. The darkness behind his eyelids offered temporary relief from the glare, but he had to fight to stay awake. If he slept now, he might not wake up in time to ward off the night's cold or to take care of the horse. The Mustang let out another tortured cough, and Jack opened his eyes, the sense of responsibility pulling him back into the moment. This wasn't just his fight for survival anymore. He'd chosen to shoulder the burden of another life. A wave of dizziness hit him, and he realized he was dangerously dehydrated. He forced himself to take another tiny sip of water from the canteen, less than he wanted, but enough to keep him conscious. The metallic taste of the container made him grimace, but he swallowed it down. He rummaged through his pack, light as it was, and found some dried jerky. It wasn't exactly hydrating, but if his body wanted the energy, this was all he had. He tore off a small piece and chewed slowly, letting the salt mix with his saliva to trick his body into producing just a bit more moisture. He couldn't offer any to the horse, not without water, and the guilt tore at him. But if he passed, out from hunger or dehydration, neither of them would make it. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust into the rocky shelter, making the horse sneeze. Jack coughed as he inhaled the grit. He rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth, spitting out the remnants of sand. This place was merciless, but the night would come soon enough. If they could hold out until then, he might be able to move more easily without the punishing sun overhead. Yet traveling at night carried its own dangers. Limited visibility, unexpected drop-offs, predators that see better in the dark. But maybe, just maybe, he'd have a better shot at finding water, or at least covering more ground without roasting alive. His mind wandered to the man who left the horse. He pictured some drunken fool stumbling away after a night of abuse, tossing the reins aside once the animal showed signs of illness. Anger flared again, hot as the midday sun, but anger wasn't going to fill his canteen. The sad truth was that cruelty like that was common enough out here, where law and order were as scarce as water. Jack had encountered plenty of people who cared more for a bottle of booze than the lives they affected. That senseless disregard, that willingness to discard another living being, sickened him. The Mustang deserved better. No living creature should be left to starve in a place like this. Jack wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dust across his forehead. He adjusted his position, trying to find a spot on the stone that didn't jab into his spine. His eyes kept drifting shut, and he jolted awake repeatedly, each time feeling a little more disoriented. His thoughts grew hazy, bouncing between memories and delirious visions of water. He pictured a cool stream rushing through a forest, the sound of it lapping at mossy rocks. Then the image transformed into a mocking mirage of the desert sun. He shook his head, forcing himself to stay anchored in reality. He needed a plan. They couldn't stay there and wait for some miracle. If the horse didn't get water soon, the infection and fever would take it. Jack would also be finished either by heat stroke or by the cold night if he couldn't replenish his supply. With a trembling hand, he patted the horse's neck. The Mustang's eyes opened slightly, meeting. His gaze with a mixture of pain and trust. Jack felt an odd surge of responsibility. This horse had survived the cruelty of a drunken owner and still found a way to press on. If the horse could keep going, maybe Jack could too. Together, they had a slim chance, better than facing the desert alone. He rose unsteadily to his feet, wiping sand off his pants, and took a few careful steps out from under the rock ledge. The sun still had an hour or two before it dipped below the horizon. He peered around at the rocky slopes, searching for any sign of moisture. Sometimes, hidden among crevices, there might be a small pool or a seep of water that dripped from the stone. His eyes raked the jagged surfaces for any hint of dark patches or green moss. Nothing. Just hard, cracked stone and the unrelenting dryness of the desert. He cursed under his breath. Maybe there was water deeper in the rocks, on the far side of the formation, but exploring it would mean leaving the horse alone. If a predator came along, or if the horse panicked and tried to move without support, that might be the end. Still, maybe a short scout would reveal a potential path to salvation. Jack weighed his options. The risk of both of them dying if he didn't find water soon loomed larger than the risk of leaving the horse for a short time. He returned to the Mustang, murmuring softly, "Hang on, girl, I'll be back." He still didn't know if the horse was a mare or a gelding, but girl slipped out naturally. He figured the horse couldn't correct him anyway. He reached for a piece of rope in his pack, a meager few feet, and loosely tethered the horse to a protrusion in the rock, just enough so it wouldn't wander off if it somehow mustered the energy. He doubted the Mustang was capable of more than a step or two, but he had to be sure. With that small measure of security, he turned and began clambering up the slope of tumbled stones. The heat radiating from the rocks felt like an oven on full blast, and the reflection made him squint painfully. He used his hands to steady himself, feeling the rough surface bite into his palms. Breathing hard, he pushed forward, ignoring the protests of his tired muscles. The possibility of finding water spurred him on. At every outcropping, he would pause to scan the area, hoping to see something that might indicate a hidden pool or a natural spring. Instead, he found more of the same: dusty rock, a few gnarled bushes, and no sign of relief. He pressed on, cresting a small ridge that overlooked the rocky canyon below. There he glimpsed a shadow that ran deeper than the rest, as though the rock might fold into a small cave or tunnel. It was a decent distance away, maybe half a mile across uneven ground. Jack's pulse quickened. A cave could mean pooled water if the subterranean areas collected rainfall or condensation. On the other hand, caves could also harbor predators. But it was a lead, and he had nothing else. He made a mental note of the direction and started back toward the Mustang. Each downward step jarred his exhausted legs, threatening to buckle his knees. By the time he returned, he was panting, coated in a fresh layer of dust. The horse lay where he'd left it, eyes half closed, breathing shallowly. Jack knelt beside it, untying the rope from the rock. "I might have found a place," he rasped. "If you can make it that far, we might get water. Gotta try." The horse only responded with a labored sigh. Jack mustered what little strength he had to guide it to its feet again. The movement triggered another coughing fit. He waited it out, grimacing as he saw flecks of foam and blood mix on the horse's muzzle. This was not a good sign. But he refused to let despair claim him. Survival was about keeping hope alive, even if it was flickering like a candle in a gale. He led the horse around the rocky promontory, slipping on loose gravel, ankles twisting, precariously. More than once he lost his footing, nearly tumbling headfirst onto the rocks. Each time he gripped the bridle or the horse's mane to steady himself, though the horse was hardly stable. The smell of infection clung to the air around them, and Jack worried that it was only a matter of time before the Mustang collapsed, permanently. Still, they pressed on, motivated by the dim prospect of water in that shadowy region he'd glimpsed. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the rocks. The sudden temperature shift as they moved in and out of shade was jarring, but it beat the scorching midday heat. Jack's heart thudded with each step. He could almost feel the dryness crackling through his veins, threatening to slow him until he could no longer move. He refused to stop. Every so often, he would whisper encouragement to the horse, as though the sound of his voice could keep them both anchored to life. Time seemed to stretch, his sense of distance warped by fatigue and dehydration. The only sure thing was that the sky was darkening, turning shades of gold and orange as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Eventually they rounded a curve in the rocky formation, and Jack spotted the mouth of that potential cave. It wasn't large, just a dark gap in the stone, partly hidden by a tumble of boulders. He guided the horse carefully over the uneven terrain, heart in his throat as they scrambled closer to the opening. Each step felt like it carried the weight of do or die. By the time they reached the entrance, dusk was upon them. A faint chill began to replace the day's oppressive heat. Jack paused, swallowing the lump in his throat, and peered inside. The shadows were thick, but a faint draft of cooler air drifted out. That was promising. If the air was cooler, there might be moisture. Deeper within, there could also be snakes or other predators lurking. But the promise of water outweighed the risk of an ambush. He grabbed a small flashlight from his pack, a battered thing with a flickering beam, one of the few modern comforts he possessed. A shaky cone of light cut into the darkness. He urged the Mustang to follow him inside. The interior smelled of damp rock. Jack's heart leapt at the scent, which stood out like a precious gift in the dryness of the desert. He stepped gingerly, shining his light across the walls. Stalactites dripped from the ceiling, forming small pools in the depressions of the floor. His mouth watered at the sight, and he hurried forward to check if it was fresh. When the beam illuminated a shallow puddle, Jack nearly cried in relief. Water. It was murky, but it was water. He crouched, dipping a hand in, ignoring how grit swirled in the beam of his flashlight. He brought it to his lips. It tasted faintly of minerals and earth, but it was water. Life. Salvation. He turned to the Mustang. The horse stood trembling in the entrance, reluctant to step onto the slick stone floor. Jack coaxed it forward. The horse's nostrils flared as it caught scent of the water. Slowly, painfully, it limped toward the puddle. Jack let the horse drink first, watching as it lowered its muzzle and took in greedy gulps. He placed a hand on its neck, feeling the tension and the feverish heat, but also a sense of relief in its posture. There was no telling if the water was entirely safe, but out here, they couldn't afford to be picky. Survival demanded they take what the desert offered. As soon as the horse had drunk, Jack filled his canteen, gulping down several mouthfuls of the gritty liquid before stopping himself. Drinking too fast could be dangerous, especially when dehydrated. He forced himself to pause, let his body adjust, then drank more slowly. The water tasted like metal and silt, but it slid down his parched throat like the sweetest nectar. He could almost feel the life returning to his limbs, banishing the dizziness. After a few minutes, he turned his attention to the horse's wound, splashing water over it, trying to clean away the dried blood and pus. The Mustang flinched but didn't pull away. Jack prayed that it would help stave off infection at least. For a while, night had fully settled outside. The temperature began to drop rapidly, a sharp contrast to the day's brutal heat. The cave shielded them from the wind, though Jack could hear it howling softly against the entrance. He found a drier patch of ground near the shallow pool and coaxed the horse to lie down. The horse obliged, exhausted, but less so than before. Jack rummaged through his pack again, pulling out anything that might serve as a makeshift bandage. He had a small length of cloth and a nearly empty bottle of antiseptic that he kept for emergencies. Carefully, he cleaned the wound, wincing at the sour smell. He poured a few precious drops of antiseptic onto the rag and pressed it against the horse's flank. The Mustang jerked, eyes rolling in pain, but Jack whispered soothing words, stroking its neck to calm it. The ragged breathing gradually eased. Jack took that as a sign the horse was stabilizing, if only slightly. He could see the pain etched in its expression, but also the gratitude, an odd thought, assigning human emotions to a horse. Yet in moments like this, the connection between man and animal felt undeniably real. He settled down beside the horse, leaning against the cool rock wall, his body finally beginning to relax. The knowledge that they had water, that they were out of direct exposure, gave him room to catch his breath. But this was only a temporary haven. They might stave off dehydration here, but the horse's infection was still a major threat, and the desert's predators would soon be on the move, searching for anything weak and vulnerable. Despite these thoughts, his exhaustion won out. He let his eyelids droop, cradling the flashlight in one hand and the canteen in the other. Just a quick rest, he told himself. Enough to regain some strength for whatever horrors tomorrow might bring. And so, in the quiet dark of that hidden cave, Jack and the Mustang held on to each other, an unlikely pair clinging to life in a land that offered no mercy. He awoke in a fit of restlessness, heart pounding as though an alarm had gone off inside his chest. The cave was silent except for the slow drip of water and the sound of the horse's breathing. Jack took a moment to recall where he was, the memories rushing back in a flood, the scorching sun, the near collapse, finding this cave. He flexed his sore muscles, feeling the stiffness from yesterday's struggles. The horse remained curled, on the ground a few feet away, head resting on its forelegs. The bandage Jack had rigged was stained, but at least the bleeding seemed to have slowed. He checked his watch, squinting at the faint glow of its face. It was some time before dawn. Outside, the wind had died down, but the air in the cave had a distinct chill. Jack refilled his canteen from the shallow pool. He noticed the water level was a bit lower, perhaps due to natural seepage or maybe the horse's heavy drinking. He took another measured sip, careful not to overdo it. As refreshing as it was, too much water too quickly could upset his system. The gritty taste was becoming more familiar, less jarring. He splashed some on his face, letting the coolness jolt his senses awake. His reflection in the water was barely recognizable. Sunburned skin, cracked lips, eyes red from fatigue. He turned to the Mustang, who stirred slightly at his movement. The horse blinked in the dim light, raising its head. Jack wondered if it was strong enough to stand. The infection still worried him, and he peeled back the bandage for a quick look. The wound was swollen, skin hot to the touch. He cursed under his breath. Without proper antibiotics or at least thorough cleaning, the horse's chances were not great. Still, it was alive, and that was more than could be said for many creatures that got lost in this desert. As dawn approached, a soft glow touched the cave's entrance. Jack considered their next move. Staying here would keep them safe from the sun, but the horse needed more than just water. They needed food, they needed real rest, and they needed to find a way out of this brutal region. If they spent too many days drifting from waterhole to waterhole, the infection might get worse or supplies would run out. Jack had to make a choice. The horse stared at him as if sensing his thoughts, and let out a low whinny. It seemed to ask, "Where next?" Jack decided to leave before the sun was fully up, hoping to cover some ground in the cooler hours. He coaxed the horse to its feet, wincing at the pained expression in its eyes. They drank again, filling themselves as much as they dared. Then Jack topped off his canteen. He scanned the cave one last time with his flashlight, noticing that it went deeper into the darkness. Perhaps there were more pools further in, or maybe hidden dangers. Exploring it fully might mean getting lost or running into venomous creatures that dwelled in the deeper chambers. He concluded it wasn't worth the risk. They had enough water for now to make a go of it on the surface, maybe find a route to civilization, or at least to a place where he could properly tend to the Mustang's wounds. They stepped out into the fresh dawn air. The desert sky was painted with streaks of pink and gold, a deceptive beauty that masked the harshness beneath. Jack took in a lungful of crisp morning breeze, momentarily invigorated. The horse limped along beside him, leaning into each stride. Jack cast a glance at the horizon, trying to gauge which direction offered the best chance of survival. He knew that traveling north might lead to higher ground, possibly into canyons where water could gather, but it could also mean more treacherous passes. South might bring them back out onto the open plain, which had nearly killed them already. He decided to follow the rocky terrain for a while longer, hoping to find a route that gradually sloped downward. With the horse's condition, steep climbs were risky. The desert was a labyrinth of hidden gullies and ravines, many of which ended in sheer drop-offs or labyrinthine passages that offered no real path forward. Jack's instincts told him that water often traveled downward, gathering in lower basins, so if he could keep heading gradually down, they might stumble upon a stream or an oasis. He just had to be mindful of flash floods in those canyons, though. The scorching drought made that seem unlikely. The morning air offered some respite from the heat, but Jack knew it wouldn't last long. The sun would ascend soon enough, blazing across the sky, making every step a trial. They had to cover as much distance as possible before that happened. The horse's progress was slow but steady. Each step looked painful, yet the Mustang moved with a quiet determination, as if sensing that staying behind was a death sentence. Jack clung to that determination, drawing strength from the horse's resilience. The memory of how he'd found it, discarded and left to die, ignited a defiance in him. He was going to prove that caretaker wrong, the one who'd thought. This horse wasn't worth saving. The desert was cruel, but Jack refused to let it swallow them both without a fight. And so they trudged on, the morning light casting elongated shadows against the rocky walls, each footstep stirring up small puffs of dust. They reached a plateau that offered a view of the desert floor below. The sight was simultaneously breathtaking and daunting. Rolling dunes and scattered mesas stretched out in every direction, a tapestry of browns, reds, and oranges. In the distance, Jack thought he spotted a thin, winding line of greenish vegetation, a possible sign of a watercourse. It was far, maybe a day's journey, but it was something. He exhaled slowly, a flicker of hope dancing in his chest. If they could make it there, maybe they'd find a more substantial water source, or even a trail leading to a settlement. He had no illusions that rescue was close at hand, but just knowing there was a possible destination lifted his spirits. Convincing the Mustang to descend the rocky slope was another battle. The horse's injured leg made steep declines terrifying. Jack walked ahead, guiding it by the bridle, each step measured to avoid a disastrous tumble. Loose stones rolled underfoot, bouncing down the slope and clattering against boulders below. The Mustang's ears pinned back, muscles tensing. Jack whispered reassurance. He felt the trembling in its limbs through the reins. The slightest misstep could send them both tumbling. They navigated the slope slowly, pausing frequently to let the horse find stable footing. Jack could feel the sweat trickling down his temples, and the sun, though still low, began to heat the rocks around them. He wished desperately for a breeze, something to cool the sweat that threatened to blind him. The horse almost slipped once, rear legs skidding on a loose patch of gravel, but Jack braced, pulling up gently on the reins, and somehow they both stayed upright. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline surging as he pictured the horrifying fall they'd narrowly avoided. After what seemed like an endless descent, they reached flatter ground. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, patting the Mustang's neck. The horse snorted, flicking its tail as if trying to shake off the tension. Now they faced a wide expanse of barren desert, stretching toward that faint green ribbon in the distance. Jack guessed it was still a good few miles away, maybe more. The sun climbed steadily, each passing minute a reminder that soon the full force of daytime would bear down on them. He pressed forward, the horse limping at his side. He dug into his pack, pulling out some of the jerky to chew as they walked. The salt stung his cracked lips, but it provided a bit of energy. The horse needed forage, real food, but the desert offered little besides the occasional prickly cactus or dry shrub. Jack kept an eye out for any edible vegetation, even if it was meager. Once he paused by a small cluster of barrel cacti. They looked plump, storing water within, but hacking into them was a gamble. Cactus water can be bitter, sometimes even toxic if you don't know the species. He decided they were too risky, especially for the horse with its already fragile state. As the hours ticked by, the temperature soared. The air felt thick and oppressive, each breath a heated gust in Jack's lungs. He checked the horse's wound again, wincing at the heat radiating from it. He poured a bit of water from his canteen over it to keep it clean, but the meager supply was dwindling. He had to balance his need to keep the horse's infection under control with his own need to stay hydrated. More than once he found himself cursing the drunken man who had started this chain of suffering. The desert wasn't a place to abandon a healthy creature, let alone a sick one. That cruelty, that callousness, fueled Jack's resolve. He wasn't going to let the desert claim another victim if he could help it. They trudged on, each step a small victory against the sweltering heat. Jack's boots left shallow prints in the dirt, and he could see the horse's hoofprints mingling with them, a testament to their shared struggle. Occasionally Jack would glance up, noticing vultures again circling overhead. The sight made his stomach twist with dread. He knew what they were waiting for, a fresh corpse to feast on. He refused to be that corpse, refused to let the horse become carrion. That grim reminder propelled him forward, no matter how much his muscles screamed for rest. The hours seemed to drag, each minute longer than the last. But slowly, painfully, they made progress. Jack estimated they'd covered a good deal of ground, though it was hard to measure in the shifting desert landscape. The green ribbon he'd spotted earlier grew more distinct, revealing itself to be a narrow line of vegetation snaking through the desert. With any luck, it might be a small creek, or at least a series of pools where water gathered. The thought kept him going even as thirst gnawed at his throat. He rationed his remaining water, allowing himself a sip every so often, guiding a few drops to the Mustang when it seemed ready to collapse. He promised them both that soon they'd have more water than they could drink. By midday the sun was at its zenith, blazing with an intensity that made the ground shimmer. Jack knew stopping in the open would be suicide, but the horse was dangerously close to heat exhaustion. He spotted a small rise in the terrain, a patch of rock and scraggly shrubs that might offer minimal shade. He led the Mustang there, sliding, into the partial shadow cast by the outcropping. The horse's flanks were caked with sweat and dust. Jack's own clothing felt plastered to his body. He removed his shirt, tying it around his head to shield himself from the sun, then rubbed the horse's neck in small circles to try to calm it. They both needed a break, but Jack couldn't help worrying that every second spent not moving brought them closer to dehydration. The dryness in his mouth was becoming unbearable, and his lips felt like they could crack open at any moment. Still, he listened to his body, forcing himself to rest for a short while. He watched the shimmer of the heat on the horizon, imagining the water that lay waiting where that line of green emerged. If it turned out to be nothing but desert brush, he wasn't sure what he'd do. He closed his eyes, letting his head droop for a moment. The horse stood by his side, breathing heavy. Flies circled around the bandaged wound, but the horse was too drained to swat them away effectively. Jack flicked them off, using the corner of his shirt, wishing he had more to help with. Time slipped by in a haze of exhaustion and burning heat. Finally, he forced himself to stand, ignoring the protest of his aching legs. They had to keep moving. The sun was still high, but he'd rather walk now and maybe reach water sooner. So they resumed their slow march. The desert floor was scorching beneath Jack's boots, and he felt the sweat evaporate almost as soon as it appeared on his skin. It was a dangerous tightrope walk between dehydration and heat stroke. He kept glancing at the sky to check for cloud cover, but there wasn't a single wisp in sight. The horizon seemed to taunt them with illusions of water that shimmered like pools in the distance, vanishing as they drew near. Finally, as late afternoon approached, they came within striking distance of that lush strip of green. Jack could now see that it was a narrow gulch lined with reeds and small trees, undoubtedly a sign of a water source. His heart fluttered with renewed hope. The land sloped gently downward, and he could hear ever so faintly the trickle of a stream. It was as if the desert itself had parted its lips to offer a small mercy. Jack urged the Mustang forward, nearly stumbling in his haste. He knew not to sprint. Heat stroke was a real threat, but the promise of cool relief was too tempting to resist. They crested a slight rise, and then it was in front of them, a thin stream meandering through the desert, surrounded by patches of green brush. It wasn't large, perhaps just a few feet wide in the deepest parts, but to Jack it looked like paradise. The Mustang seemed to sense the water's presence, picking up its pace slightly despite its limp. When they reached the bank, the horse practically dragged Jack forward, plunging its muzzle into the flowing water. Jack fell to his knees and scooped water into his mouth, ignoring how the silt and pebbles gritted against his teeth. Cool liquid flooded his senses, washing away the dryness, replenishing life into his parched body. For a long, glorious moment, he forgot the heat and the pain, immersing himself in the simple act of drinking. When he finally surfaced from that first frenzy, he forced himself to slow down. It wouldn't do to get sick from overhydration or from whatever bacteria might lurk in the water. He checked on the horse, which was still drinking in heavy gulps, water cascading from its muzzle. He poured some over the wound, washing away the crusted grime. The horse flinched but then relaxed, as though grateful for the cool sensation on its inflamed flesh. Jack rubbed its side, feeling the trembling subside a bit. He dared to hope that this might be the turning point, that they'd survive after all. The sun was dipping lower, its fierce intensity waning. Shadows stretched long along the creek bed. Jack looked around. The vegetation was sparse, but enough to provide some grazing for the horse if it could manage to eat. He led the Mustang to a patch of grass near the water. It sniffed around, nibbling tentatively. While the horse foraged, Jack refilled his canteen and took the opportunity to clean himself up a bit, splashing water over his face and arms. The coolness was a balm on his sunburned skin. Despite the relief, he knew they weren't out of danger. The infection in the horse's wound was still a major issue, and the desert nights could be unforgivingly cold. But for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of optimism. He decided they'd make camp here by the stream, at least for the night. He found a flat patch of ground slightly above the creek bed, ensuring they wouldn't risk flooding if a sudden surge of water rushed in. He gathered some dead wood from the brush and started a small fire before the sun completely vanished, the faint glow offering warmth and a bit of safety from any roaming predators. As dusk settled, the sky turned a deep shade of purple. Stars beginning to flicker into existence overhead. Jack removed the makeshift bandage, washing it in the creek, then carefully re-bandaged the horse's wound with what few medical supplies he had left. The horse stood patiently, as though it understood the process was necessary. When Jack was done, he gave the horse a gentle pat, and it responded by nudging his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like gratitude. The flicker of that bond between them, forged by shared suffering, warmed Jack's heart more than the fire ever could. He settled down to rest, the gentle murmur of the stream lulling him into a calmer state than he'd experienced in days. The desert night sky sprawled above a vast tapestry of stars. In that moment, he felt both insignificant and strangely empowered, as if their survival against the odds was a testament to the unbreakable spirit of living things. A wave of exhaustion washed over him, but it was the pleasant kind that followed, a hard-won struggle rather than the desperate fatigue that had plagued him earlier. He closed his eyes, listening to the horse shuffle nearby, and allowed himself the luxury of feeling safe at least for one night. Morning arrived with the subtle glow of dawn, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. Jack stirred, saw, but not as desperate as before. He rubbed his eyes and checked on the horse, which lay on its side, breathing steadily. The wound still looked angry, red and swollen, but it didn't appear to be bleeding. Jack hoped that the cleaning and rest might have given the horse's immune system a fighting chance. He rose and stretched, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. The desert might be peaceful in the early hours, but he knew how quickly it could turn deadly once the sun climbed higher. He refilled his canteen, drank, and ate a small portion of jerky to curb his hunger. The horse seemed interested in the patches of grass by the creek, so Jack let it graze, mindful to keep watch for any dangers. The desert had a way of surprising you with rattlesnakes or coyotes lurking among the rocks. As the horse nibbled tentatively, Jack began to think about their next steps. He needed to get this animal to real medical care, or at the very least to a place with better supplies. Wandering aimlessly through the desert wouldn't cut it. He needed a plan. He recalled that many desert settlements or ranches often sprang up near reliable water sources. This creek could be part of a larger watershed that eventually led to civilization. Jack considered following it downstream. Where there's water, there's life, and possibly other humans. It might be a long journey, but aimlessly crossing. The desert in random directions was worse. At least with the creek, they'd have a steady supply of water. He looked at the horse, assessing whether it was well enough to travel. The limp was still there, but the horse walked more steadily this morning. The infection, however, wasn't going to just vanish. Jack reasoned that as long as they had water, they could manage the horse's fever. But time was still against them. The desert was unpredictable, and so was infection. Any day the horse could take a turn for the worse. Deciding it was better to move sooner rather than later, Jack packed up what little he had. He scrawled a message on a flat rock with charcoal from the fire, just in case someone else stumbled upon this camp. But he doubted the utility of such an act. The desert was vast, and this creek might see few visitors. Still, some part of him wanted to leave a sign that they'd been here, surviving against all odds. He guided the horse downstream. The bank was muddy in places, forcing them to navigate carefully. At times the horse let out a pained snort or stumbled, but Jack would pause, offer some water, and coax it along. The midday sun started to intensify again, but traveling along the creek provided some relief. The vegetation, while sparse, offered occasional patches of shade. He dipped his bandana in the stream and draped it over the horse's neck to help cool it. The horse glanced back at him, almost curiously, but allowed it to remain. As they followed the winding course of the creek, the land gradually changed from barren desert to rolling scrubland. Small clusters of bushes and stunted trees became more frequent. The presence of birds, sparrows and finches, lifted Jack's spirits. Where birds could live, humans might too. And where humans lived, there might be a vet, or at least someone who knew how to treat a horse properly. The horse's breathing sounded a bit clearer, though the occasional cough reminded Jack that they still had a long way to go. By late afternoon, Jack spotted something on the horizon that made his pulse quicken. A thin column of smoke, as if from a distant chimney or campfire. He pointed it out to the horse, though the action was more for his own excitement than anything else. He decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a ranch, a campsite, or any sign of human habitation. Each step brought fresh uncertainty, but also the potential for salvation. They walked for hours, the sun dipping low in the sky. Finally, Jack made out a small homestead nestled among the brush. It was modest, just a wooden cabin, a rudimentary fence and what looked like a corral. A scattering of chickens pecked at the dirt, and he saw the silhouette of a person moving around near the house. Jack's heart pounded with relief and anxiety. Approaching strangers in a remote area always carried risks. You never knew how they'd react to an unexpected visitor. But he had no choice. He had to try. The horse's life might depend on it. He raised a hand in greeting as he drew closer, calling out so they wouldn't be startled. A wiry woman emerged from behind the house, a rifle in her hands. Jack froze, hands up to show he meant no harm. The woman squinted at him, then at the horse. After a tense moment, she lowered the rifle, stepping forward cautiously. Jack explained their predicament, speaking hoarsely from thirst and exhaustion, pointing to the horse's injury. The woman, who introduced herself as Evelyn, nodded grimly and motioned them inside the corral. Evelyn's homestead was simple, but functional. She had a small well, a rain barrel, and a makeshift stable for her own horse, a sturdy mare that pawed at the ground as Jack led the Mustang inside. Evelyn wasted no time examining the wound. She hissed at the sight of the infection and quickly fetched antiseptics and bandages. Jack could have cried with gratitude. He watched as she expertly cleaned the injury, applying ointments that he recognized from his meager medical knowledge. The Mustang flinched but didn't resist. It was as if it understood this was help at last. Evelyn showed Jack to the well, letting him draw a bucket of fresh water. He drank deeply, refilled his canteen, and poured some for the horse. The difference in taste from the creek was noticeable, pure and cool. He felt his body almost singing with relief as the water coursed through him. The woman then offered him a seat on her porch and handed him a tin cup of coffee, lukewarm, but it tasted like heaven. Jack sipped slowly, letting the flavor wash over him. He tried to express his gratitude, stumbling over words to convey how much her help meant. Evelyn shrugged it off, saying something about how only a monster would turn away a wounded animal, and a man at the edge of collapse. She did, however, seem curious about how he'd come to be out there, leading a half-dead Mustang. Jack told her the abridged version, the drunken owner who'd abandoned the horse, the days of wandering, the near-death struggles, and his determination to save this creature at all costs. Evelyn listened, her brows creased in concern and quiet outrage. She nodded, acknowledging the cruelty, but not entirely surprised. In a land like this, she explained, people either learned compassion through hardship or they let the desert's harshness seep into their souls. The man who had abandoned the horse was the latter kind. She believed that both Jack and the Mustang were incredibly lucky to have made it this far. After a while, she led Jack to a simple cot in an adjoining shed. It wasn't luxurious by any stretch, but it had a roof, blankets, and was infinitely better than sleeping on rocky ground. He thanked her again, though words felt insufficient. The day's exhaustion weighed on him like a lead blanket, and as soon as he lay down, sleep dragged him under. He awoke the next morning to the sound of clucking chickens and the pungent smell of horse ointment. Blinking away sleep, he limped out to the corral, finding Evelyn already at work, brushing the Mustang's coat. The horse stood more steadily than before, bandaged flank looking cleaner. Jack marveled at the transformation in its demeanor, a certain brightness in its eyes that hadn't been there in days. It nickered softly when it saw him, and he couldn't help but smile. Evelyn explained she'd given the horse a mild antibiotic injection that she kept on hand for her own livestock. While it was meant for smaller animals, she hoped it would stave off the worst of the infection. Jack knew it was the best care the Mustang had received in a long time. He wondered if the horse would make a full recovery, if it would ever be able to run wild again. Watching it now, standing tall despite its obvious pain, he believed it was possible. Over the following days, Jack helped Evelyn with chores around the homestead, in gratitude for her hospitality. He mended fences, hauled water, and even offered to track down some supplies from a small trading post she mentioned was a few miles away. In turn, Evelyn showed him how to properly care for the horse's wound, how to apply warm compresses to help with swelling, and which herbs around the area could reduce fever. Jack soaked up the knowledge like a sponge, determined to give the Mustang the best shot at a full recovery. He could see the horse gaining strength day by day, limping less, appetite returning. It allowed Jack to clean its wound without too much fuss, and each morning it seemed a bit more alert. Evelyn insisted that the horse rest at least a few weeks before attempting any serious travel. Jack agreed, though a part of him yearned to move on, to do something about the man who had left the horse in such a state. But vengeance or justice seemed secondary now. The desert had already exacted its toll, and the horse's survival was proof that cruelty didn't always win. In quiet moments, Jack would stand by the corral, stroking the Mustang's mane, thinking about the bond they'd formed in that harsh wilderness. He realized that his own survival had hinged on saving this animal. Had he chosen to walk away, he might have become just another lost wanderer in the desert, with vultures picking his bones clean. Saving the horse gave him purpose, and that purpose gave him the will to live. Eventually the time came when the Mustang could walk without much pain. The infection, though not entirely gone, was under control. Its coat had regained a bit of shine, and the feverish dullness had left its eyes. Jack tested it by leading it around the yard, impressed by how far it had come. Evelyn watched with a proud smile, arms folded over her chest. She offered to sell Jack a proper saddle and gear at a discount, pointing out that if he intended to ride this horse, he should do it right. Jack hesitated at first, because the horse had been wild once, but it seemed oddly willing to accept him. Perhaps their shared adversity forged a trust that normally would take months or years to build. Grateful, Jack used what little money he had to purchase the tack. Over the next few days, he gently introduced the saddle, letting the Mustang get used to the weight. The horse flinched the first time, possibly recalling the ill-fitting gear from its previous owner, but Jack's steady reassurance calmed it. Soon he was able to mount carefully, shifting his weight so as not to aggravate the healing wound. The horse snorted but didn't buck. Jack felt a surge of emotion as he eased the horse into a gentle walk around the corral. They were along, away from galloping across open plains, but it was a start. He began to plan his departure. He didn't have a fixed destination, but he knew that staying at Evelyn's place forever wasn't an option. She was kind, but he was a stranger who'd shown up unannounced, and the desert had plenty of other souls who might need her help someday. With the horse now on the mend, Jack felt that pull toward the horizon again. Evelyn understood. She gave him extra bandages, some herbal remedies, and a week's worth of supplies. Her only request was that he repay her kindness by treating the horse well and telling others of her small trading post if they needed a place to rest. On the morning he set out, the sun was just cresting the eastern hills. He mounted the Mustang, feeling the strength of the animal beneath him. The wound still bore a bandage, but it no longer oozed infection, and the limp had all but disappeared. The horse tossed its head, as if ready for a new adventure, and Jack couldn't help but smile. Evelyn stood at the gate, rifle slung over her shoulder, waving goodbye. He tipped his hat, one she'd given him to replace his tattered bandana, and thanked her one last time. Then he nudged the horse forward, and they began their slow trot away from the homestead. As they rode, the desert opened up before them, vast and unyielding, yet somehow less intimidating now that they had survived its worst. Jack felt the Mustang's rhythmic breathing, the powerful muscles moving beneath its sleek hide. He thought about how close they'd come to death, about the drunken man who had left this magnificent creature to starve. That man would never understand the bond formed in hardship, or the quiet triumph of proving that compassion could beat cruelty. The horse's ears swiveled back toward him, as if checking that he was still there, and he patted its neck. They were in this together, now. Days stretched into weeks as they roamed, sometimes staying near water sources, other times crossing rugged paths in search of fresh pastures. Whenever they encountered a rancher or a traveler, Jack would ask if they'd heard about a horse being abandoned by a drunk, though he never quite found a solid lead. Perhaps it didn't matter. The horse was free from that fate, and Jack had discovered a sense of purpose in caring for it. He named the Mustang Reckon, a word that had drifted through his mind as a nod to the reckoning they'd both faced in the desert. Reckon adapted well to being ridden, perhaps because of the bond they'd forged when survival was on the line. Jack began to trust Reckon's instincts, noticing how the horse sensed sources of water or reacted to danger before he even saw it. It was like they were tuned to the same frequency, a silent language of caution and care. The memory of their harrowing journey still lingered, Though with each passing day the musty odor of sickness and fear gave way to fresh air and open skies. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, they found themselves atop a ridge overlooking a valley dotted with mesas. Jack dismounted, letting Reckon graze on the sparse grass. He gazed out at the expanse, recalling how uncertain every step had been back in that scorching canyon, how he'd nearly lost hope. And here they were now, alive, free, stronger. He felt a lump in his throat, a swirl of emotions that he couldn't quite pin down. Gratitude, pride, and maybe a tinge of sadness for those who never made it out of the desert. He decided it was time to share their story, to prove that from the depths of cruelty and despair, something incredible could emerge. He took out a worn notebook, one of the few personal items he always carried, and began scribbling notes. He described the day he found Reckon, the thirst, the infection, the nights they huddled together against the cold. He detailed Evelyn's kindness, the transformation from near death to vibrant life. That night, under a canopy of stars, he wrote, until his eyes grew heavy. He wanted a record of it, so that no one could dismiss the resilience they'd shown as some passing fancy. In the morning, they set off again. Jack had no grand plan, only a quiet conviction that they'd keep going, maybe find a place where they could settle or help others who were struggling. As they rode, he spoke softly to Reckon, recounting their journey, as if the horse understood every word. Sometimes Reckon would flick an ear or snort, and Jack liked to think it was an acknowledgement. The desert stretched on, but it felt different. Now, less of a graveyard, more of a frontier teeming with possibilities. Weeks turned into months as Jack and Reckon traversed canyons, crossed small desert towns, and even took up odd jobs on ranches to earn enough for supplies. Everywhere they went, people noticed Reckon's scarred flank and the gentle way Jack cared for the horse. Some asked questions, and Jack would oblige them with a condensed version of the story. He never tired of telling it, even though it reopened old wounds each time. The retelling was a reminder of what they overcame, a testament that hope could flourish even in the harshest landscapes. One day, they arrived at a modest ranch on the edge of a lush river valley, an oasis compared to the barren lands they'd traversed. The ranch owner, a grizzled man named Ortega, needed help breaking wild horses. Jack was hesitant at first. He knew what it was like to be on the receiving end of cruelty, but Ortega assured him that they used gentling techniques, not brute force, and that he'd pay a fair wage. Jack looked at Reckon, recalling how the horse had once been wild and had endured the worst. He agreed on one condition, that he handle the horses with the same compassion he'd shown Reckon. Ortega nodded, and so began a new chapter. Jack spent days in the corral, working calmly with skittish Mustangs, using patience instead of intimidation. Reckon would watch from a distance, ears perked, as if guiding Jack's movements with silent understanding. Over time, the wild horses responded, growing trusting under Jack's gentle hand. Ortega marveled at the transformation, crediting Jack's unique bond with Reckon for teaching him how to approach each horse with empathy rather than force. Jack's reputation grew, and more Mustang owners came to see if he could help them. Eventually, he saved enough money to buy a small plot of land near Ortega's ranch. It wasn't large, a modest piece of the valley with a few trees and a meandering brook, but it was a place he could call home. Reckon had a safe pasture to graze, free from the memories of starvation and abandonment. Jack built a simple shelter, improving it bit by bit with each passing month. He didn't need much, just enough to keep the sun and rain off him and the horse. His days were filled with the satisfying rhythm of ranch work, feeding horses, mending fences, training and caring for animals. In the evenings, he'd sit by the brook, knees pulled to his chest, listening to the gentle rush of water. Sometimes, he'd catch a glimpse of his reflection and remember a time when he was half dead in the desert, clinging to life with a dying horse at his side. Reckon would wander up, nuzzle him, and in those moments, Jack knew they'd both found something far richer than just survival. They'd found a purpose. He never forgot the drunken man who set this all in motion. In quiet moments, he wondered what had become of that man, if he even remembered the horse he'd left to die. But Jack had moved beyond bitterness, realizing that focusing on that man's cruelty would only taint the new life he and Reckon had built. Instead, he poured his energy into ensuring no horse under his care ever faced such neglect again. And so, with the passing of time, the story of Jack Carson and Reckon became something of a legend in the area. How a sick Mustang and a determined wanderer beat the odds in the blistering desert, forging an unbreakable bond. Locals would share, the tale embellishing it with each retelling, but the core truth remained the same. Compassion can spark a miracle, even in the direst of circumstances. And if you listened on certain quiet nights, you might hear Jack recounting the story himself, by the glow of a lantern, telling wide-eyed ranch hands how he and Reckon had conquered the desert, one agonizing step at a time. That's where our story ends. Two survivors, man and horse, forging a new path beyond the cruelty that tried to destroy them. They stand as living proof that hope and determination can outlast even the harshest trials. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find inspiration in these words. Remember, we upload every day at the same time, and we'd love for you to be a part of our community. Thanks for staying with us until the end of this incredible journey.